Let me show you a different way to write the nextNum program. Let's take a look at nextNumShort.asm. Basically, it is exactly the same as nextNum.asm. In fact, it will produce exactly the same binary file. The only difference between this program and nextNum.asm program is that here we use the following macros: invoke and cinvoke. Instead of pushing each of the arguments ourselves, we can use the invoke macro. This macro is basically going to push each of the arguments in the correct order, and then it is going to call the function. In this case, it will call getStdHandle. The invoke macro is for calling functions in the stdcall calling convention, as opposed to the cinvoke macro, which allows us to call functions which follow the cdecl calling convention. Here, for example, we call the printf function. The printf function here is given exactly one argument: enter a number. The invoke and the cinvoke macros becomes pretty useful at the point where we are dealing with functions with many arguments. As an example, take a look at readFile. Let's compare this formulation with the formulation inside nextNum.asm. On the right we can see nextNum.asm, and on the left we see nextNumShort.asm. Note that in order to call readFile in nextNum.asm program, we need many lines of code, about 6 lines. Using the invoke macro, we could do it in only one line. Of course, we get a long line, but it is still only one line. As a result, this program, nextNumShort, has less lines, where nextNum.asm looks longer. I just want to note that those two files produce exactly the same program. Invoke and cinvoke are not instructions. They are just assembly macros. The assembler will replace this macro with the code that we have seen inside nextNum.asm. It will just replace this line with push std input handle followed by call to get std handle inside brackets. In the case of cdecl functions, it will also balance the stack in the end, which means that in this case, for example, in cinvoke printf enter number, the assembler is going to replace this line with the lines push enter number followed by call printf inside braces, and finally add esp4, just like we can see in nextNum.asm here. Preferring to use invoke and cinvoke over the usual way is really a matter of taste. Many programmers prefer this form. However, I have seen programmers that prefer many short lines over one long line. At this point you have written enough code to decide for yourself. Let's summarize what we have seen here. We've seen the two macros, invoke and cinvoke. You can use invoke for std call functions and cinvoke for cdecal functions.